3 November 1946, Hanover, British zone of occupation. In a school copybook he kept hidden behind the stove, a 38-year-old teacher wrote a sentence he could not say aloud: "We will build our democracy on silence because truth cannot be rationed." He was named Carl. He did not write his surname, he wrote the date. He wrote the place. He wrote the place. He wrote the line. And then he put the notebook away. This is his story. And the story of a country trying to learn how to live after losing a war. And the arithmetic of that learning: calories, rooms, jobs, files, years. Not casualties, not firepower. The arithmetic of bread and paper. 8 May 1945. Hanover lay in pieces. It was not unique. There were cities that were worse. There were cities that were better. The British Army of the Rhine counted windows with glass. The number was small. The bridges over the Lane were broken. The tram lines tangled in the streets like wire pulled from a wound. In the reports of the Control Commission for Germany, British element, there were phrases like substantial destruction, debris clearance ongoing, population morale uncertain. The rubble landscape stretched block after block. Blocks became quarters. Quarters became cities. In Berlin and Munich and Dresden, women formed lines with buckets. In Hanover, they did the same. Trümmerfrauen, a word that would be used for a generation. They picked up the bricks and stacked them. They learned to clean mortar with small hammers and make the good bricks ready to build again. There were not enough men. Some were dead. Some were in camps. Some were missing. The women dug in the ruins for soup pots and shoes and photographs. In Karl's quarter, where the school had been hit in 1943, a dozen women worked in the mornings before the curfew at night. They were photographed once by a British corporal from a jeep, and their faces were not posed and not smiling. The photograph would be catalogued in a British military government file: civilians, debris clearance, Hanover, June 1945. He did not write about the rubble in his notebook at first. He wrote a list of names. Students, missing. He crossed out 2 when word came that they had been killed in a train near Magdeburg. He left the others. He wrote to addresses that were also ruins. The occupation forces entered with orders, interpreters, and curfews. The orders were printed on posters in German and English. The interpreters were mostly Germans who had left before 1939 or Polish Jews who had learned German in ghettos and camps. The curfews changed. In June, a British order set the lights out at 2,000 hours. In July, it was 2,000 hours. The curfew was enforced by patrols that moved slowly. Allied intelligence summaries described the city as docile but hungry. The summaries did not mention cold. That would come later. There was fear of retribution. There were rumors of shootings in the east. There were rumors of Russians taking watches in herds. In the British zone, there were rumors of British decency. The British had orders for decency. There were events that were not decent. There were British officers drunk in requisitioned houses. There were German girls waiting in the dusk near barracks. There were beatings when a man on a bicycle tried to pass a convoy. There were things one did not write in a teacher's notebook in November 1946. But they were not the largest things. The largest things were food and time. The mathematics of food began with a card, a ration card issued by a clerk who had once worked for the city under different options. There were categories: heavy laborers, sedentary workers, children, pregnant women. Each had a number. Each number had calories attached like a price tag. The British economists wrote memoranda about targets of 2,000 calories. The actual ration in Hanover in the summer of 1945 was often 1,200. It fell to 1,040 that winter. It would fall further in the hunger winter of 1946, 647, when the coal trains did not arrive and the potatoes were frozen in the ground. The arithmetic of survival was simple and complicated at the same time. Simple, 1 card plus 1 cue equals a loaf of bread if you were lucky and if the flour had arrived. Complicated, a card could be altered, a cue could be skipped, rationed goods could be taken and traded for milk or fats on the black market with cigarettes of American brands. Camel, Lucky Strike, Chesterfield. In the British intelligence files, the black market had a weight, like contraband had a weight in wartime ships. It was measured by arrests and seizures and by price. A bicycle was 10 packs, a pair of boots was 20, a tin of corned beef was 6. Cigarettes became currency because they did not ask questions. Bread asked questions, butter asked for proof, cigarettes asked for a light, and then perhaps a bed. Carl wrote in his notebook in pencil so it could be erased. Card today. Beans at school. English sergeant coffee. Bitter. Good. He wrote that he went to the countryside on a Sunday, on shoes that were not made for walking, to barter for potatoes. The word in the city was hamstern, to hoard, to gather like a hamster. He went with a colleague from the school whose husband had not come back from the Balkans and whose child had been hungry since August. They brought a gramophone needle and a scarf. They returned with a sack. In the sack, the potatoes were small. Some were rotten. They sorted them in the hallway on a newspaper with a portrait of someone who had been a leader until a week ago, and now existed only in an Allied wanted poster and in photographs that would later become exhibits in trials. Immediate after war, the rubble, the women with buckets, the ration cards, the black market, the cigarettes in the pockets of men with accents who could give you a bar of soap that smelled like America, the fear, the curfew, the missing. He was not a party man. That is how he would answer later. There would be a questionnaire. There would be an oath. He would write that he had not been a party member. He had paid arrears twice in 1939 to be kept in his post when the headmaster asked for a membership card. He would write that it was a formality. In his notebook, he wrote in 1946, signed something in 1947, signed something in 1937 to keep the post, needed to be quiet. The handwriting pressed hard through the thin paper. In the Spruchkammer files compiled later, such a line would be called a mitigating factor if backed by testimony of anti-Nazi conduct. In a country of millions, the mathematics of guilt would begin to be totaled in lists and forms. The denazification began with paper. The Americans designed a questionnaire for their zone. The number of questionnaire for their zone. It asked where you had been in 1933. It asked if you had donated money to certain organizations. It asked if you had attended meetings. It asked if you had read certain newspapers and whether you had burned books. In the British zone, the questionnaire was shorter. The categories were the same. The Spruchkammern were the tribunals that sat in municipal buildings with broken windows and heard cases. The categories were named Hauptschuldige, major offenders, Belastet offenders, Minder Belastet, lesser offenders, Mitlufer followers, and Entlastet, lesser offenders, Mitlufer followers, and Entlastet, exonerated. The hearings used to be announced on sheets of paper stapled to doors. Spruchkammer Hanover, Sitzungstermin. People waited on benches. People stood. People whispered. The British observers wrote notes about procedure and tone. The German assessors, men and women chosen because they had not been party members or because they said they had not, listened as the accused explained themselves. Most people re-described their pasts. Most used the words only and forced and did not know. Some wept. Some shook their heads in anger when someone they knew pretended they had been a resistor. There were affidavits that were called Perselschein, like certificates of washing because they cleaned a reputation. A pastor would sign for a clerk would sign for a baker, a teacher would sign for a neighbor. The mathematics of guilt was not perfect. It was not equal. It was not only arithmetic. It was also politics and need and time. The new administration required clerks. The police needed men who knew the streets, even if they had worn a uniform that had been feared. The schools needed teachers who knew how to control a classroom. The economy needed engineers. The Army of Occupation wrote in 1947 that security demands required the use of qualified personnel, irrespective of prior affiliations, provided they are not active Nazis. The phrase active Nazi would be defined and redefined in memos. The categories would be applied with rigor in some towns and with expediency in others. A Bundesarchiv record from Lower Saxony would later show that in 1947 in the British zone, a small percentage were classified as major offenders. A larger percentage were offenders. Many were called followers. Followers were the grease in the new machinery. They filled the desks, stamped the forms, balanced the accounts, and went home to apartments where expellees were sleeping in the kitchen because their own houses were gone. The Spruchkammer recorded the case of a teacher named K.M. in 1947. It exists in a file in a provincial archive. It contains a questionnaire with small check marks. It contains a typed statement. Der Betroffene gibt an. Die Mitgliedschaft als formale Bedingung zur Aufrechterhaltung seiner Stellung als Hilfslehrer erworben zu haben. The verdict called him a Mitläufer. The fine was 10 Reichsmarks, to be paid in installments. In later years, in oral histories, former Nazis remembered these fines as a nuisance and as an injustice. Victims remembered them as a joke. The arithmetic of guilt was counted in marks and in nights without sleep. It was a poor arithmetic. It did not yield a single correct answer. He taught children whose fathers were dead and whose mothers were in the rubble lines, and children who had come from the other side of maps. The displaced persons were nearby. The camp at Bergen-Belsen, 12 miles from Shelley, did not vanish when the British filmed the corpses in April 1945 and burned the huts. It continued as a DP camp, with barbed wire and food delivered in trucks and a population that grew from the ashes. Jews who had survived by hiding and by force of will created schools within the fence and produced newspapers in Yiddish. Poles who had been forced laborers built small temples to a nation they had lost. The British officers visited with clipboards. In Hanover, there were smaller DP camps in requisitioned barracks and schools. German civilians knew they were there. They saw the men and women from the camps on the trams. There were fights when a German woman boarded a carriage left for DPs. There were markets where a German housewife bought a piece of bread from a Ukrainian who had found extra in a broken crate. There were also men who spat. There were whispers. They have it better than we do. It was an ugly whisper. It was recorded in a British intelligence summary as evidence of continued anti-Semitism among the population. There were also forced tours of camps in April and May. Photographs show villagers led past pits filled with bodies. Not everyone was led that way. Not everyone meant it when they said that they had not known. The words "in our name" were not common in 1945. They would become common later. The films called Die Todesmöhlen were shown to German audiences. The newsreels were mandatory for permits for cinema operation. People went to the cinema to be warm in winter. They saw bodies on the screen. They looked away. A woman in Karl's building said, "Do not make me look at that. My son is missing." This was an arithmetic of sympathy, and it was partial. He saw DPs in the market near the Markthalle buying onions with foreign currency and cigarettes. He saw one man with a yellow star sewn again onto his coat, not by compulsion, but because he was mourning and because he had a right to mark the world. Karl wrote in his notebook, "At Belsen, there are schools. Their pupils are older than mine. They look like my pupils." He did not show anyone this sentence. He did not show anyone most sentences. The train stations filled with Germans coming from east of the Oder. The expulsions were a policy and a movement and a catastrophe. The Potsdam Agreement spoke about population transfers that would be orderly and humane. They were not orderly. They were not humane. Millions were put on trains in Silesia, in East Prussia, in the Sudetenland, in Pomerania. They carried suitcases made of cardboard. They carried photographs, documents, children, chickens, and habits. They ended their journeys in towns that were already in ruins. They were called Heimatvertriebene. They came to Lower Saxony in numbers that the British had not planned for. British occupation reports from 1946 and 1947 are full of sentences like refugee influx overwhelming, insufficient housing, tension between locals and newcomers. In Hanover, the arithmetic was rooms. A room was 4 walls, a stove, a window, a door. A city ordinance backed by British orders made compulsory the assignment of rooms to refugees. People whose apartments had survived were visited by officials. The phrase was Einquartierung. A file from the Municipal Housing Office lists a furniture restorer, a floor below Karl as having 2 rooms and therefore having 2 rooms and therefore having to surrender one to a family from Breslau. There were arguments at landings. There were fights. There were acts of kindness. A woman from Königsberg told the oral historian in the 1970s that her landlord was rough but fair. He took the children to the zoo when it reopened. A man from Hanover told the same researcher that the newcomers smelled of the East. He did not think it was an ugly phrase when he said it. He thought it was descriptive. It was a judgment. Jobs were arithmetic too. A factory that could employ 200 men had been bombed. It had a new owner from the British military who had been given authority to reopen it. It would employ 50. There were 100 jobs for 500 men. The numbers did not fit. The result was anger in queues and men standing in squares near the rat house waiting for a foreman to say come, and then waiting again the next day. The anger was not always political. It was also arithmetic. The mathematics of scarce rooms, scarce jobs, scarce food. The beer halls reopened slowly. The tables were not wiped fully clean. There were arguments. There were words like, we have suffered. There were words like, we did not know. There were also words like, that is a Jew, and that is a commissar, and they will come back if we are not careful. The Cold War had not yet announced itself with the blockade in Berlin, but it was in the papers. The British were polite about it. The Americans were less polite. The Soviets were matter of fact. The Germans were anxious in all directions. The school where Karl stood in front of a class in 1946 had a hole in the roof patched with tar paper. The blackboard had been salvaged from a building that had burned. The chalk had to be begged from a British sergeant who passed it out with a smile. He did not ask what history was being taught. The British instructed that history should be taught without propaganda. It was a concept vague and precise at once. The Kultusministerium of Lower Saxony published guidelines. The Nazis were to be named as criminals. The Weimar Republic was to be described as an attempt at democracy that failed. The Kaiser's empire was to be described neutrally. The Allied re-education program supplied pamphlets on the Magna Carta and on municipal governance. The mathematics of memory began in the lesson plans. A paragraph was worth a few minutes of time. A chapter was worth a week. The list of names worth remembering was too long to fit in a school year. The Bolsheviks were a paragraph in 1946, and they would become a chapter in 1949. The Jews, the Roma and Sinti, the political prisoners, the forced laborers, they were paragraphs. They were paragraphs that were often skipped because the children had to be given arithmetic and writing, and because the parents questioned if the topics were healthy. The headmaster told Karl to keep the tone balanced. Balance was another word for silence, not always, but often. He was asked to rewrite a chapter. In 1947, the British Zone's School Book Commission set new standards for history textbooks. The publishers in Hamburg printed volumes with clean type and thin paper. A letter from a British educational officer to the publishers spoke about avoiding nationalist distortions. The same officer marked the Treaty of Versailles as controversial. Karl was invited to a seminar at the Lehrerbildungsanstalt to review draft pages on the year 1933. He wrote in the margins, Hitler appointed by constitutional means, mass support, terror. He crossed out misled people and wrote complicity. He did not speak that word in staff meetings. He wrote it in pencil. In the printed book distributed in 1948, the paragraph read, "A part of the population supported the new regime out of fear and hope. Many followed." The word complicity did not appear. It had been replaced by a safer word, passivity. The hunger winter came like a long breath you could not exhale. 1946 turned to 1947 with coal trains frozen in sidings. The British military governor in Lower Saxony wrote a report in January. Fuel shortage critical, bread rations reduced, unrest possible. The average calories per day in Hanover fell to numbers that would be called sub-sustenance by Allied nutritionists. People queued in the dark. People burned books to heat stoves. A teacher's notebook mentions burning a Latin dictionary for warmth in a school office. It was a small dictionary. It did not help much. There were snowdrifts in the streets, pressed into dirty sculptures by the wind. British soldiers wore thick coats. Civilians wore everything they owned at once. The black market moved indoors. In cellars, deals were made in whispers. Cigarettes were counted by the light of a candle. A piece of lard has a certain arithmetic, calories multiplied by hope. It was rationed like time. The city administration tried to control the flow. They drew up lists of illegal traders and published warnings. The warnings did nothing. The traders were not stupid. They were not heroes either. They were vendors in a market economy of collapse. A British officer wrote, "Black market is a safety valve. To crush it entirely would mean riots." That was cold. It was also accurate. There were hunger deaths. They were counted at the city morgue. A registry entry in February had a column for cause of death that read, Erschöpfung, exhaustion. The numbers are small compared to wartime mass murder. They are still numbers that change lives. There were children whose growth was stunted. There were old men who died in their chairs under blankets. There were letters to sons in prisoner of war camps that said, "Do not come, there is nothing." There were sons who came anyway and took their places in bread lines with their old uniforms turned inside out. Denazification continued in parallel. The Sprüchkammern rendered their judgments. The categories blurred. The British were impatient. They wanted it over. The Americans had begun the process with intensity. They were already backing away in 1947, citing practicality. The French cut through the paperwork where it suited them. The Soviets did not hold Sprüchkammern. They held trials. They did other things. The West Germans would pass laws that adjusted the weights in the arithmetic of guilt. In 1951, there would be Article 131, which allowed the reinstatement of civil servants who had been removed because of their Nazi past. That was later. The ground was being laid now. Offices could not run on blank paper and empty chairs. The mathematics of guilt intersected with the arithmetic of fear. People told their stories in ways that made them livable. A man said, "I joined for the job." A woman said, "My husband was forced." A teacher said, "I signed a form to keep my post." These were not always lies. They were sometimes truths broken into smaller pieces. The system needed stability more than thorough justice. This is not a moral excuse. It is an archival fact. The numbers bear it out. In the British zone, of millions screened, only a fraction classified as major offenders were punished harshly. Many followers returned to their desk chores. They stamped and filed. They became democracy's stable hands. This sentence sounds easy. It was not easy to the victims. It was not easy to the men in British uniforms who had seen the stacks of corpses at Belsen. It was the result of a chain of necessities and choices. The occupiers tried to build a new civic culture. They opened libraries. They funded youth clubs. They organized exhibitions about British constitutional history. They supported newspapers that printed articles about civil liberties and the duty to vote. They allowed expellee organizations to print their own trauma in newsletters. The arithmetic of printed words multiplied. There were too many sentences pointing in different directions, and a teacher had to pick which ones to carry into a room full of cold children. There were moments of contact that could not be rationalized. In June 1947, a group of German teachers visited the DP camp at Bergen-Belsen. It was part of the re-education program. The British officer with them wore a cap with a badge. He asked the teachers to speak with the camp's school principal. He was a man from Lodz whose parents had died at Kelmno. He had a chalkboard in a barrack and pupils with older eyes than their years. He said, "We teach history through stories. We cannot get through the day with dates." A German teacher wrote in his notes, "We teach dates because stories hurt." The man's name was not recorded in the British officer's report. The report said that the visit was cordial and instructive. Karl did not go on that visit. He read the report later. He walked to a corner store near the DP camp's supply road in Celle and watched the trucks. He wrote in his notebook, "The water at Belsen is brown. The British bring tins for them. They are alive. We are alive. What do we owe them?" He did not show this line to anyone. It did not fit in a classroom. June 1948 arrived with trucks and announcements. Currency reform. The Reichsmark died. The Deutsche Mark was born. People lined up at distribution centers and were given 40 D-Mark in 2 installments. They took the bills and looked at the portraits. It was a clean paper. The black market stumbled. Prices appeared on signs that had been blank or had carried numbers that meant nothing. The word in the streets was Wirtschaftswunder, but that word had not yet been invented. The mood changed in a way that diaries and British intelligence summaries record with surprise. "Spirits lifted," writes a British officer. "Shops filling," writes another. "Queues shorter." A barber put out a sign that said, "We cut hair and we are paid." A housewife came home with a pineapple from a Marshall Plan shipment, her first, and wrote later, "I did not know such fruit existed beyond pictures." The Marshall Plan shipments arrived in port and moved inland. They were counted in tonnage on the docks and in calories in kitchens. They were also propaganda. The aid came stamped with an American label. It was photographed and written about and used to build goodwill in a world that was dividing.